my topic is really Mission Studies in an Age of Religious Pluralism, 3 glimpses. The glimpse, a personal glimpse, an historical glimpse about missionary attitudes toward religions, and a contemporary glimpse at what mission studies might look like, one way in which mission studies might be evolving into something different. So first of all, the personal glimpse. In 1988, the World Council of Churches sponsored an anniversary celebration, not the Judson one, but celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 1938 Tom Brahm Mission Conference. And they held a celebration at Madras Christian College, India, and then a little theological consultation about Christianity and other religions, which I was privileged to attend. And I remember being a little awed to be sitting around a table with Wilfred Cantwell Smith and Leslie Newbegin and a bunch of other people from around the world. But my reason for bringing this up is the two were an instructive pair, to my mind. That Wilfred Cantwell Smith, this great figure in the rise of religious studies in the Western Academy, who had sort of brought comparative religion into a certain kind of prominence and taught it in Canada, at Harvard, and so on. But he began his career as a missionary teacher in an Indian college under the Canadian Missionary Society, even though he went on to be an academic in the West. And Newbegin, from the Church of Scotland, probably the most notable mission thinker of the 20th century, had spent most of his life living in India, in a Christian minority community amongst Hindus and Muslims. And to my mind, they demonstrated that in this argument about the right path for missions, and at that moment, a very intense mission between the dialogue people and the evangelism people, that mission history actually testifies on both sides of that question. So that Smith represented the whole project we think of as religious studies, and it had its origin in Christian mission. The empirical firsthand study of other traditions, their practices, their texts was begun by Christian missionaries. It was done for the purpose of learning to spread the gospel, but it was done conscientiously in the belief that the spread of the gospel couldn't be served except by the truth about other traditions. If you go back to the earliest layers of true research about the traditions of China or Asia or Africa, you find missionary authors at the source in a time when no one else took world religion seriously. Missionaries spent the time in language acquisition and text study and translation and dialogue to lay the foundation for the academic world we take for granted. Well, I said that Wilfred Cantwell Smith represented in his biography the roots of religious studies in mission. Leslie Newbegin, on the other hand, represented the kind of mission practice that the champions of dialogue had a hard time condemning. I mean, he spent his life more or less in contact and dialogue with people from other traditions and learning about those traditions and so on. And my point is, he was more representative of the intellectual history of mission than most people realize. That the actual practice of mission almost always revamped people's assumptions about what they were doing. So missions and missionaries are supposedly the source of the hardline perspective that Christianity and other religions have nothing to do with each other. That religion's one thing and Christianity is something else. That there's natural religion and natural revelation, but on the other side of it is revelation and special truth. But actually, that view, which was so much criticized, for instance, in my meeting in 1988, had flourished amongst missiologists much more in the 20th century than it did in the 19th century. And Tom Brahm in 1938 had been a high watermark at that sort of hardline approach. The preceding history had actually been, in many ways, quite a bit different. So that leads me to my second glimpse, the historical glimpse. The 19th century was the great century of Christian mission, and the 1910 Edinburgh Mission Conference was the marquee event that came at the end of a century of extraordinary mission effort. And in preparation for that conference, several commissions were set up to deal with different topics. Commission 4 had the topic, the question, the Christian message in relation to non-Christian religions. Okay, there's our issue. And as material for that report, questionnaires were sent out to 200 missionaries around the world. Pretty extensive questionnaires for them to respond to as preparatory material for the report of the conference. The reports of the Edinburgh Conference, that is, their final reports got published, but those questionnaires lay in archives for years until Kenneth Cracknell in the 70s unearthed them. And he finally wrote a book in 1995 based upon those questionnaires. What were the missionaries around the world saying about this question at that time, the turn of the 20th century? And he said what they were saying was pretty much an anticipation of everything that happened in the theology of religions in the coming century, was already there in their reflections on their own experience. The book he wrote took its title from the words of T.E. Slater, one of those missionaries who had written, "We will never gain the non-Christian world until we treat its religions with justice, courtesy, and love." Justice, Courtesy, and Love is the title of his book. And why isn't that story more widely known? Well, because something happened after Edinburgh. World War I, World War II. The next great mission conferences were Jerusalem in 1928 and Tambaram in 1938. So dramatically and increasingly, by the time of 1938, when the shadow of war was across Europe, the discussion of mission had been rerouted, I think. The discussion of other religions had become dominated by an outlook that really was thinking only of a few other religions, and the other religions they were mainly thinking of were the neo-pagan forms of fascism in Europe. The 1938 Mission Conference was famous for a book by Hendrik Kramer called The Christian Message in a Non-Christian World that stressed the discontinuity between the two. The Christian message is one thing, religions are something else. That might have been the right theology to resist Nazism, but it was not the right theology for understanding the world religions. It was a dramatic backward movement from the views of the missionaries who had written the questionnaires at Edinburgh. So strangely enough, in my Tambaram meeting in 1988, the supposed theology of mission that was being so heavily attacked had been more characteristic of theologians 50 years earlier than of missionaries 100 years earlier. So that leads me to a third glimpse. The third glimpse has to do with a project I've been involved in recently, and it's striking. It's a project that was developed by two missiologists, essentially, Terry Muck, who's a missiologist who teaches at Asbury Seminary in Kentucky, and Francis Adney, who teaches at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary in Louisville. Both of them are longtime missiologists, very much involved in that guild. Terry, at least, is is a card-carrying evangelical of sorts. He used to be an editor at Christianity Today. But he's also one of the founding members of the Society for Buddhist Christian Studies. And this was his idea. He said, I'd like to write up sort of vision for Christian mission, a contemporary sort of missiology theory. I'd like to do it in collaboration with people from other religious traditions. And when I first read his proposal, it brought me up short. I thought, well, comparative theology, dialogue, and so on, yes, we do this in lots of topics, but mission is not the topic I would think of at the head of the list for something you would do comparatively. In other words, it sort of seemed like this would be to say to people, you don't want us to do this at all. But if we are going to do it, how would you like us to do it? What kind of a conversation would that be? A very interesting conversation, I think. The format was pretty simple. It was, so what do you, as a Hindu or a Buddhist or someone, what do you think about this idea of how Christians should go about carrying out their mission? So these conversations were some of the most interesting conversations theologically I've been in for a while. So I just want to give you a few little snapshots of some of the learnings for me, anyway, that came out of that process. Let me take the Hindu conversational perspective. Arvind Sharma, as a Canadian Hindu scholar, was the participant. And said, in the Hindu tradition, conversion per se is a kind of inadmissible or suspicious category. It's not something that's being sought. And he was quite straightforward to say, you know, Hindus have a universal mission in the world, which is to convince people that conversion is a bad idea. But it is a universal mission. He was quite clear about that. That's not just a truth for us, it's also a truth for you. And it's a kind of good news. We think it's good news that we should share with the world, that conversion is not necessary. And we'd like to share it with you. So we had an interesting discussion about that. Around well, we both have missions. How can we share these missions with each other? But he's also interesting because he took up the challenge to do Christian theology. Since you're inviting me, I'll take a shot at it. And he said, you Christians, it seems to me, have the answer to your problem right in the middle of your own tradition. He said, you have this problem about God's omnipotence and human freedom. And you resolve that problem by saying God voluntarily limited God's self, emptied God's self, so as to allow creation and human beings freedom and agency. You have another problem, which is the divine and the human in Christ. Christ is divine and Christ is human. And you solve that problem by saying God limited God's self, emptied God's self, to make space for humanity in the divine nature. So you just have one more step to say. Say, solve this problem about the church and the world by saying, well, the church has a mission to convert the world to God and so on, and yet to respect them at the same time. He said, well, it's easy. The church should empty itself to make space for others, for their tradition and for their witness and for their, he said, you can fulfill your mission. That's just my neighborly suggestion to you, is that you think about taking those Christian elements in your tradition and applying them to your ecclesiology and mission. Okay, well, Mark Uno was the Buddhist conversation partner, and he too had skepticism about Christian mission, but he said it's true, Buddhism is a missionary religion. We're a universal missionary religion. We've gone through different cultures, converted different peoples. From the beginning, we've been a missionary religion and have thought about how to communicate our teachings to people in different settings. But he pointed out something that I'd never really thought a lot about, and that is that he says Buddhism has also, at its very roots, a counter-mission theory. It's evidenced in the recorded reluctance of the Buddha to preach to others. He has to be persuaded to do this because he has a lot of reasons why it's a bad idea. The assumption is that when the teaching is given, it's pure, and over time it's going to degenerate. And things will get worse and worse. The teaching will tend to degrade. So it's going to be spread, the word's going to be spread, but when it's spread, it's going to decay. So we don't really associate the success of the mission with good things. We associate the success of the mission with also some bad things. So he said, I think that would be good for you to think about. That there's good things and there's bad things that come with success of mission. So I look at the Buddhist experience of expansion, and I see a lot of negative things. Well, the Jewish participant, Yaakov Ariel, had a very different perspective on some of these questions. He said, in general, if there's a Jewish mission to the world, it rests in fidelity to our own community life. What we can do for anybody else is to be good at being us. That's what God has asked of us. God hasn't asked us to go change the world. God has asked us to be faithful to the covenant that we've undertaken. And if that's a light to the Gentiles, fine and good, but it's not really our problem to worry about it anymore. On the other hand, he says Jews have good historical reason to be interested in Christians' theology of religions because we've always been on the other end of them. We're really happy to be involved in this conversation because we have a real stake in it. And so we have a few ideas we'd like to offer. But he also noted that Jewish opposition to the whole idea of mission and conversion was not really all that settled until it was sort of fixed in place by Christian persecution. Jews were more open to the idea of conversion in Second Temple period and so on than that they are later because it's been made a means of persecution for them until they want nothing to do with it themselves. He said, but actually we're going to have to change our mind about that because there isn't going to be a future for the Jewish people if we don't learn to exercise a certain kind of mission in the world. And the Chabad and other forms of Judaism that undertake this now are really making us rethink Maybe we need to learn something about mission from Christians. Well, the Muslim scholar, Amir Hussein, said, you know, well, at least in these two communities, we're pretty much on a clear common ground. We want to missionize you, you want to missionize us. Bring it on. I mean, there's a certain clarity there. We both have the same scriptural tradition. We both have some of the same mandates. We both think we're doing some of the same things. We call it dawah, you call it evangelism, tomato. We're really about wanting other people to become part of our community. So on the one hand, perfect agreement. On the other hand, total confrontation. So is there any way we can help each other in our mutual reflection on these issues? Well, he said, of course, we can help each other think about how to evangelize others, and Christians or Muslims, but that actually when you share so much, it may be the only effective way you could actually missionize or evangelize people in the other group is to more effectively live out your common shared values. In other words, what would make a Christian take a Muslim witness seriously and vice versa? It would be seeing them doing an extraordinarily good job of fidelity to the values that are also our values. How can you not respect that? How can you not be attracted to that? So he said this, he called this mission by mutual attraction. If you're good at loving God, and we both say that's what we're about, I'm attracted to somebody who's good at loving God. I want some of that too. But that's the way we can witness to each other most effectively. And the last person I'll mention, it's an interesting example. Randall Paul is a Mormon. So he was an interesting addition to the conversation because Mormons are real clear on mission. And a special case for Christians because many Christians would say, but they're not a world religion, they're a sect. So what about that? How is the Christian view of mission to be related to those who want to missionize us out of a version of our own tradition? And Mormons are very well known for the certainty of their mission commitment and the two-year missionary obligation. And actually, we spent a lot of time talking about that. How does that really work? He encouraged all the participants not to avoid doctrinal, theological issues. He says there is a sense in which steel sharpens steel, that we need each other to keep each other theologically honest. And somebody can do that from within your own tradition. The, quote, deviants in your tradition can do that in a certain way that people from other religions can't. And he said, a lot of Christians think Mormons are crazy, but it's good to have to try and validate that belief. So I found this a really interesting experience. Now, it's a very specialized activity. As I say, it wouldn't have happened, it wouldn't have worked if it weren't the case that these little group of people had relationships of trust amongst them. But I can see a lot more of it happening in the future. Because, and this is my story, because it was the reality in the past. The missionaries who filled out those questionnaires for Edinburgh, they were living with neighbors of other faiths. They were dialoguing with them. They were living in their religious environments and so on. So I think Kenneth Cracknell's title was a good title, that the future of mission studies in a pluralistic world will be one where these issues are addressed religiously with justice, courtesy. Thank you.